I need you to understand something before I tell you this, because I have thought about how to say it for a long time. I am not the kind of man who sees things that are not there. I spent 22 years in the Army, and I have been in places that would make most people's hair go white overnight. And I never once came back from any of them with a ghost story. Not a single one. Until Monte Cassino. It was February of 1944, and the monastery sat up on that ridge the way it had for 14 centuries. Like something that had been watching the valley below it, long before any of us arrived with our guns and our orders. We had been pinned down in the mud for weeks, breathing artillery smoke and learning to stop counting the dead. But what I saw moving along that broken wall on the third night, I have never once stopped seeing in 50 years of trying. It was wearing the shape of a monk. Whatever it was carrying inside, it was nothing close to holy. My grandfather never talked about the war. Not at Christmas, not after a few drinks, not when the old war films came on television and the rest of the family would settle in and watch. He would just quietly get up and find somewhere else to be. We learned not to ask. You could see something move behind his eyes when the subject came close, something that had no interest in being looked at directly. And so we respected that, and we left it alone for decades. He passed in 1987, and it was only when my mother was clearing his belongings that she found the letters. There were 11 of them, written to nobody, never sent, folded inside a biscuit tin at the back of his wardrobe beneath his service medals, and a photograph of a ridge I did not recognize at the time. It took me 3 days to read them all, not because there were many words, but because I kept having to put them down. His name was Thomas Riley. He was a private in the Royal Sussex Regiment. And in the winter of 1944, he was 23 years old and standing at the base of a mountain in Italy, wondering if he was going to survive the week. He did survive. He came home, married my grandmother, raised 4 children, and spent the rest of his life never once speaking about what he had seen on that ridge. These letters are why I am here. This is his story, told the way he wrote it in his own words for the first time. To understand what these men experienced on that ridge, you have to understand what Monte Cassino was before the war arrived and tore it apart. Because this was not just a building. This was not just a military position on a hill that 2 armies happened to fight over. This place had been standing since the 6th century, since a monk named Benedict of Nursia climbed that mountain in 529 AD and built something that was meant to last forever. And for 1400 years, remarkably, it did. The Abbey of Monte Cassino sat at an elevation of 516 meters above the Liri Valley in central Italy, and it dominated everything below it the way a cathedral dominates a small town. Except that this cathedral could see for miles in every direction. Armies had come and gone beneath it for over a millennium. The Lombards sacked it. The Saracens burned it. The Normans seized it. Earthquakes brought sections of it to the ground. Every single time, it was rebuilt. Every single time, it rose back up from whatever had been done to it and resumed its position on that ridge as if nothing had happened. As if it had simply been waiting for the interruption to pass. By 1944, it housed one of the most important manuscript collections in the world. Monks still lived inside its walls. When the Germans established their winter line across central Italy and made the decision to fortify the high ground, Monte Cassino became the anchor of everything. The Gustav Line, or as it was called, ran directly through that ridge, and whoever held the monastery controlled the only viable road north to Rome. The Allies needed that road. The Germans understood exactly what that meant. What followed was one of the longest and most brutal land battles of the entire Second World War. 4 separate Allied offensives between January and May of 1944. Polish troops, American troops, British troops, French-Moroccan troops, New Zealanders, Indians, and men from across the entire world converged on a single mountain in Italy and died on its slopes in numbers that are still difficult to absorb. Estimates place total Allied casualties across the campaign at around 55,000 men. The German defenders suffered somewhere between 20 and 30,000. The valley below the monastery became a landscape that survivors described as the surface of the moon, except that the moon does not smell of cordite and decomposition. The monastery itself was bombed by the Allies in February 1944 on the belief that German observers were using it as a forward position. It was later established that no German soldiers had been inside the building at the time of the bombing. What the bombardment produced was not a cleared position, but a perfect ruin, a labyrinth of broken walls, collapsed archways, and deep shadow that the German paratroopers then occupied and defended with extraordinary effectiveness. It was into those ruins that Thomas Riley and his regiment were ordered to advance. And it was inside those ruins that something was already waiting. Thomas wrote about the cold the way you write about something that never truly left you. Not the cold of a bad winter at home, not the kind you complain about over a cup of tea. This was a cold that had intention behind it. Or at least, that is how it felt after enough weeks inside it. It came up from the ground through your boots, and it came down from the ridge through every gap in your uniform, and it settled somewhere behind your eyes and stayed there. The men stopped mentioning it after a while because there was nothing useful to say about it that had not already been said. The valley smelled of two things predominantly. The first was mud, a particular kind of mud that had been churned and rechurned by artillery until it had the color and consistency of something that had never been earth at all. The second smell was one that every man in that valley recognized, and none of them ever described in letters home. You learned to breathe through your mouth after the first week. By the third week, you stopped noticing, which, in its own way, is worse. They had been pinned down for so long that the ridge had stopped feeling like a military objective and started feeling like a permanent condition of the world. You would look up at it in the gray morning light, and it would look back at you. The broken walls of the monastery visible against the sky like a row of broken teeth, and the German guns positioned somewhere inside that rubble would remind you at irregular intervals that they were still there and still paying attention. The irregularity was the worst part. A constant bombardment you can almost adjust to. It is the silence between the shells that does the real damage. The silence where your imagination fills in everything the enemy has not yet done to you. Thomas wrote that the men in his section had 3 ways of dealing with it. Some of them talked constantly, about anything, about home and food and women and football, anything to fill the silence. Some of them went completely quiet and stayed that way for days, communicating in nods and gestures like men who had forgotten language was an option. And some of them, Thomas included, found themselves staring up at that ridge at night, long after they should have been sleeping, watching the darkness above the ruined walls for reasons they could not have explained to anyone. On the third night, the darkness on that ridge stared back. The first letter began with an apology. He wrote that he was sorry for never saying any of this out loud, and that he hoped whoever was reading it would understand that some things sit in a place inside you where words cannot reach them for a very long time. Then he wrote this: I am going to tell you about 3 nights. They happened in sequence, each one following the last the way steps follow each other, going down into a cellar, to each one taking you further from the light than the one before it. By the third night, I understood that whatever was happening on that ridge was not something I had a category for, and I have spent the rest of my life making my peace with that. The first night was the night of the patrol. We had been sent up the eastern face of the ridge in a section of 8 men to establish whether a section of the monastery's outer wall was passable for a larger advance the following morning. Our sergeant was a man named Corporal Davies, which sounds like a contradiction, but Davies had been acting above his rank for so long that nobody remembered what his actual stripe count was anymore. He moved through broken ground, the way some men move through a crowded room, like he was reading something in the rubble that the rest of us could not see. We reached the outer wall around 2 a.m. The bombing had opened a section of it wide enough to walk through without ducking. R and Davies went first, and we followed him in single file into what had once been a courtyard of some kind. The moonlight came down through a collapsed section of roof and lay across the stone floor in a pale rectangle. And inside that rectangle, there was a layer of dust and ash from the bombardment that had settled so completely undisturbed that you could have pressed your hand into it and left a print. Davies stopped us with a raised fist, and we all went still. On the far side of the courtyard, standing in an archway that led deeper into the ruin, was a figure in a dark robe, hooded, perfectly still. The way it stood was not the way a man stands when he has heard something and is listening. It was the way something stands when it has been standing there for a very long time and has no particular intention of stopping. Davies turned to me, and I could see in his face that he had already decided he was not going to say what he was looking at out loud. "Movement at the arch," he said very quietly. "Could be a local." "That is not a local," I said. "Could be a monk." "Davies, the monks were evacuated in November." He looked at me for a moment, and then he looked back at the arch, and the figure was gone. No sound of movement, no footsteps on the stone. The ash on the floor of that archway, when we checked it afterward, was completely undisturbed. We completed the patrol and came back down, and neither of us mentioned it in the debrief. I have thought about that decision many times since. I think we both understood instinctively that saying it out loud in front of the others would do something to the section that could not be undone. The second night, I went up alone, which was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I have ever done, and I have genuinely never decided which. I want to be precise about why I went. It was not courage. It was closer to the feeling you get when you have seen something move in a dark room, and you are lying in bed telling yourself it was nothing, except that the feeling refuses to leave. And eventually, the only way to address it is to get up and look. I needed to know whether what I had seen was a man, because if it was a man, it was a German soldier, and that was dangerous but comprehensible. I could put a category around that. I could hand it to the part of my brain that knew how to handle dangerous and comprehensible things. I reached the courtyard at around midnight. The moonlight was coming from a slightly different angle, and the pale rectangle on the floor had shifted toward the eastern wall. The ash was still undisturbed. I positioned myself inside what remained of a doorframe on the northern side, and I waited. For 40 minutes, nothing happened. I was beginning to feel like a fool, which at least was a feeling I recognized. And I was about to leave when the temperature in the courtyard dropped so suddenly and so severely that my breath came out of me in a cloud, even though the night had not been particularly cold on the way up. Then there were 3 of them. They came from different points simultaneously, which is the detail that has stayed with me longer than any other, because it meant that wherever they had come from, they had arrived together, as if on a signal, from 3 separate directions at once. One from the arch, where we had seen the first figure the previous night. One from a collapsed section of wall to my left. One from directly above me, on what remained of a walkway that I had not even registered as structurally sound enough to carry weight. They stood in a loose triangle around the center of the courtyard, facing inward, and they did not move. The hoods were deep enough that I could not see faces, and I want to say that the absence of visible faces was somehow worse than if they had turned and looked at me, because it meant I could not read intention in them, could not find anything human to fix my eyes on. They were shapes. They were presences. They were the feeling you get standing at the edge of something very deep, with no railing. I did not move for a very long time. When I finally came back down the ridge, my hands were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The third night, I did not go up voluntarily. Davies came to me before stand to, with his face arranged in the particular way that sergeants arrange their faces when they are about to ask something they have no right to ask. "I need you to come back up there with me tonight," he said. "Why me?" "Because you have already been twice, and you came back both times, and I need someone with me who is not going to fall apart." "What makes you think I am not going to fall apart?" He looked at me for a moment. "Are you?" "Probably not," I said. "Good enough," he said. We went up after midnight, the two of us, and we reached the courtyard and we waited. And at some point in the early hours of the morning, the temperature dropped again, and they came again. The same three figures in the same positions, the same absolute stillness, the same hooded absence of faces. Davies stood beside me with his rifle in his hands, and I could hear his breathing change when they appeared, that particular involuntary shift from normal breath to the breath you take when your body is making decisions independently of your mind. We watched them for what felt like a very long time. Then one of them turned. Not toward us, not exactly. But the hood moved, the way a hood moves when the head inside it has redirected its attention, and the direction it redirected toward was the section of the wall where Davies and I were standing. There was nothing inside that hood that I could see. There was nothing inside that hood that I wanted to see. Davies put his hand on my arm, and we backed out the way we came, slowly, without speaking, without turning our backs on the courtyard, until the wall was between us and it. When on the way down the ridge, Davies said only one thing. "We are not putting that in the report." "Agreed," I said. "And we are not going back up there at night." "Davies," I said, "I will go back up there in daylight with a full section and a good reason, and I will do my job. But I will not go back up there at night for anything this army can offer me." He nodded once, and that was the end of it between us. We never spoke of it again. I have no idea what Davies made of it for the rest of his life. I hope he found a way to put it somewhere manageable. I never did. Thomas Riley was not the only one who came back from that ridge different. I want to be careful about how I say this, because it would be easy to make it sound more dramatic than it needs to be. The truth is already dramatic enough. In the weeks following those 3 nights, at least 4 other men from regiments operating in the same sector of the Monte Cassino ridgeline returned from night patrols with accounts that their commanding officers variously recorded as exhaustion, shell shock, and combat stress, and in one case simply the phrase soldier unfit for further night operations, with no further elaboration offered and none apparently requested. None of these men knew Thomas Riley personally. None of them had spoken to him about what he had seen. They had gone up that ridge independently, on separate nights, with separate sections for separate military purposes, and they had come back down carrying something in their faces that the men who had not gone up did not have. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a man who has seen something he cannot explain and has made the decision to keep it inside him permanently. Once you know what that silence looks like, you start to see it everywhere. Every one of those men had it. I am telling this part of the story on behalf of someone else, and I want to be upfront about that. The man at the center of this account was a New Zealand infantryman named Corporal James Tate, who served with the 2nd New Zealand Division during the Monte Cassino campaign in the spring of 1944. James Tate died in Auckland in 2003 at the age of 81, and he refused every single request to speak publicly about what happened on the night of March the 14th for the entirety of his adult life. What we know comes from 2 sources. The first is a recorded conversation his daughter Margaret made in 1999 when she sat with him for 3 evenings and asked him, gently and persistently, to tell her anything he was willing to tell. The second is the account of Private Leonard Shaw, the only other surviving member of the six-man patrol who was willing to go on record, and who gave a lengthy interview to a regimental historian in 1987 that was archived and largely forgotten until a researcher came across it 12 years later. Between those two sources, this is what happened. The patrol was assigned on the evening of March the 13th. 6 men under Corporal Tate were to enter the monastery ruins from the western approach, or map a specific section of the interior for a planned artillery adjustment, and return before first light. It was considered a moderate risk assignment. The western approach had been used twice before without serious incident. Tate had led both of those previous patrols and was considered by his commanding officer to be exactly the right man for it. Steady, experienced, not given to nervous behavior under pressure. Shaw described the early part of the approach as unremarkable. Cold, dark, under the usual sounds of a battlefield that is resting rather than sleeping. The 6 of them moved well together, communicating in the compressed signals of men who have trained beside each other long enough that words are mostly unnecessary. They reached the western entrance to the ruins at approximately 1:30 in the morning, and Tate took them through in pairs, 30-second intervals, covering each other as they moved through the gap in the outer wall and assembled in the passage beyond it. The passage led into a long interior corridor, the ceiling partially collapsed, the floor uneven with rubble and the remnants of carved stonework that the bombardment had brought down from the walls. Shaw said it was the kind of place that made sound behave strangely, that a whisper carried further than it should, and a footstep seemed to arrive at your ears slightly after the foot had landed, as if the space itself had a small delay built into it. They were approximately 40 meters into the corridor when the man at the front of the column stopped. His name was Private Hemi Walker, and Shaw described him as the most physically fearless member of the section. A man who had gone over open ground under direct fire twice in the preceding month without apparent distress. Walker stopped so abruptly that the man behind him walked into his back, and Walker did not react to the collision at all, which was the first indication that something was wrong with him specifically, rather than with something in the corridor ahead. Tate moved up to the front and looked at Walker's face, and then looked at what Walker was looking at. Shaw was behind Tate and could not see past him clearly, but he described seeing Tate go very still in a way that was completely unlike Tate's normal stillness under pressure. He said there was a difference between a soldier being still because he is assessing a situation and a soldier being still because the part of his brain responsible for assessment has temporarily stopped functioning. This was the second kind. "Corporal," Shaw said quietly, "what are we looking at?" Tate did not answer immediately. When he did answer, his voice had something in it that Shaw said he had never heard in it before and never wanted to hear again. "Count them," Tate said. Shaw moved up beside him and looked down the corridor. There were 5 of them this time, not 3. 5 hooded figures standing in the corridor at irregular intervals, the furthest one barely visible in the darkness at the edge of Shaw's torchlight. The nearest one close enough that Shaw found himself noticing the fabric of the robe, which was dark and coarse and moving very slightly in a way that had no relationship to any air current Shaw could feel on his own skin. None of them were moving, and none of them were facing the patrol. They were all oriented in the same direction, toward the eastern wall of the corridor, as if they were attending to something in the wall itself that only they could perceive. Walker had not moved. Shaw put a hand on Walker's shoulder, and Walker's shoulder was rigid in a way that muscle is not supposed to be rigid, locked, as if every fiber in his body had contracted simultaneously and was refusing to release. And Shaw said it was like touching a man made of wood. "Walker," he said, "look at me." Walker did not look at him. "Hemi." He used the first name deliberately. "Hemi, look at me right now." Walker turned his head very slowly, and Shaw looked into his eyes, and what he saw there was an absence that frightened him more than the figures in the corridor had. Walker was present in body and gone in every other sense, looking at Shaw from somewhere very far behind his own face. Now Tate made the decision in the same moment. "We are leaving," he said, at a volume that was just above a whisper and just below a normal speaking voice. And it was the particular tone of a man who has stopped performing the role of someone in control and is simply stating what is going to happen as plainly as possible. "We are leaving now, and we are leaving quietly. Shaw, you have Walker." Shaw put Walker's arm over his shoulder, and they moved back down the corridor the way they had come. All 6 of them. In a silence that Shaw described as the most concentrated silence he had ever been part of, every man understanding without being told that the most important thing in the world at that precise moment was to make no sound that might cause any one of those figures to redirect its attention toward them. They reached the outer wall and came back through the gap and kept moving until they were well clear of the ruins, and the cold night air of the valley was around them again, when only then did Tate call a halt and let them breathe. Walker sat down on a piece of broken masonry and put his face in his hands. Nobody spoke for a while. Eventually, one of the other men, a private named Cooper, said quietly, "What were those?" It was not structured as a question. Tate looked at him for a moment. "I do not know," Tate said. "They were not Germans," Cooper said. "No," Tate said. "They were not Germans." Another silence settled over them. "Are we going to talk about what they were?" Shaw asked. Tate looked at him with an expression that Shaw spent the rest of his life trying to find the right word for, and eventually settled on bereft. Not frightened, not angry. Bereft, as if something had been taken from him up in that corridor that he had not known he possessed until it was gone. "No," Tate said, "like we are not." They returned to their position, and Tate filed a report stating that the western approach was compromised by unstable structural conditions and that the patrol had withdrawn for safety reasons. Nobody questioned it. Walker was stood down from active patrol duties the following day with a notation of combat fatigue in his record. He never returned to full active duty, that he was shipped home to New Zealand 4 months later and spent the remainder of his life in a small town outside Wellington, where, according to his family, he slept with a light on every night until the day he died. James Tate came home and lived a full life by most external measures. He worked, he married, he raised children, he grew old. But Margaret, his daughter, said that there was a room inside her father that was always locked, and that in 40 years she only ever saw the door open once. During those 3 evenings in 1999, when she sat with him and asked him to tell her anything he was willing to tell. He told her about the corridor. He told her about the figures. He told her about Walker's face. Then he closed the door again, and it stayed closed until he died. There is one detail that sits between these 2 accounts like a splinter that will not work itself out no matter how much time passes. Thomas Riley, writing alone in his bedroom in 1974, describing what he saw in that courtyard over 3 successive nights, noted that the temperature dropped suddenly and severely each time the figures appeared. He used the word intentional to describe it, which is an unusual word to reach for when describing a change in air temperature. But Thomas was precise with language, and he chose it deliberately. "The cold," he wrote, "felt intentional, like something adjusting the conditions of a space before entering it." Leonard Shaw, giving his recorded interview to a regimental historian in 1987, 13 years after Thomas wrote those letters and with no conceivable access to them, described the moment before the figures became visible in the corridor with the following words. He said the air changed first. He said it went cold in a way that felt purposeful. Purposeful. 2 men. 2 separate nights, 2 separate sections of the same ruin, 13 years apart and no connection between them. They both reached for the same word. What I am about to share with you was not easy to find, and it was not easy to read. In 1952, a German archive researcher working through a collection of personal effects recovered from the Monte Cassino battlefield came across a bundle of letters inside a water-damaged canvas satchel that had been cataloged, boxed, and left untouched since the end of the war. Most of the letters were routine: family correspondence, personal notes, the ordinary private communications of a man a long way from home in circumstances he had not chosen. But the final letter in the bundle was different. It was longer than the others, written in a smaller and more careful hand, as if the writer had been conscious of space and did not want to waste a single centimeter of the page. And it was addressed to nobody. Like Thomas Riley's letters folded inside their biscuit tin, it had never been sent. Like Thomas Riley's letters, and it had clearly never been intended to be sent. It was written for the same reason Thomas wrote his, because the man who wrote it needed to put it somewhere outside himself before it consumed him entirely. The soldier's name was Heinrich Brandt. He was a Fallschirmjäger, a German paratrooper, 26 years old, assigned to the 1st Parachute Division that held the Monte Cassino position through the winter and into the spring of 1944. By all accounts, in the records that exist around his name, that he was a competent and dependable soldier who had served without serious incident from North Africa through Sicily and into the Italian campaign. There is no record of any psychological report filed against him. There is no record of any disciplinary action. He was, by every available measure, a steady man. The letter has been translated from the German. I'm going to read it to you as directly as the translation allows, because I think it deserves to be heard in his voice and not filtered through mine. He wrote this: I have decided to write down what happened during the nights of the occupation because I am finding that the alternative, which is to carry it without setting it down anywhere, is becoming something I cannot sustain. I am not a superstitious man. I was raised in a household that had no patience for superstition, and I have seen enough of the world in this war to believe that most of what frightens men can be explained by exhaustion, by fear, or by the particular way that darkness and stress collaborate to produce things in the mind that are not present in the world. I believed this completely until the monastery. We had been inside the ruins for approximately 6 weeks when it began. The bombardment had left the interior of the building in a condition that I can only describe as a kind of deliberate chaos, as if something enormous had reached down and rearranged everything with the specific intention of making it as difficult as possible to move through. We had established our positions in the more structurally sound sections and learned the passages between them well enough to move in darkness without light, which was a necessary skill given that any light source visible from the valley invited immediate attention from Allied artillery. It was during one of these night movements between positions that I first saw them. I was moving alone through the long interior passage that ran along the northern face of the building, a route I had used without incident perhaps 30 times before this night, when I became aware that the temperature in the passage had changed. I want to be precise about this because it is the detail that I keep returning to. It was not that the passage became cold in the way that a passage becomes cold when the wind finds a gap in the stonework. It was a change that happened too quickly and too completely for that explanation to hold. One moment the air was the same as it always was in those ruins at night, which was cold but manageable. The next moment it was something else entirely, a cold that seemed to come from inside the space rather than from outside it, as if the passage itself had exhaled. I stopped walking, and I stood very still, and I looked ahead of me into the darkness. There were 2 of them at first, standing in the passage perhaps 15 meters ahead of me, side by side, facing in my direction. Dark robes, deep hoods, the kind of stillness that living things do not naturally maintain. I stood and looked at them. And I am ashamed to admit that it took me longer than it should have to reach for my weapon, because some part of me had understood immediately that a weapon was not the appropriate tool for whatever I was looking at, and that reaching for it was a gesture that would accomplish nothing beyond making me feel marginally less helpless. I challenged them. I used the standard challenge, and I used it twice, and at a volume that I am aware now seems absurd, given the circumstances, but which felt at the time like the only available script. Nothing responded. They did not move. They did not speak. They simply stood there in the darkness of that passage, and I stood there looking at them, and between us was a silence so complete that I could hear my own pulse. Then a third figure appeared behind them. It did not come from either end of the passage. I want to be very clear about that because I know how it sounds. It was not there, and then it was there, in the space between the other two, as if it had stepped through the wall itself, or as if my eyes had simply failed to register its arrival. Which is the more rational explanation and the one I have tried to hold on to since. The three of them stood together, and I backed away from them the way you back away from something, when turning your back on it feels genuinely dangerous. Slowly, keeping them in my sight until I reached the junction at the end of the passage and put the corner of the wall between us. I reported nothing. I told nobody. I returned to that passage in daylight the following morning and found nothing to indicate that anyone or anything had been present. The stone floor carried no marks. The walls offered nothing. Whatever had been there in the night had left no evidence of itself, except inside my own memory, where it has remained ever since, with a clarity and a persistence that ordinary memories do not have. I have spoken to one other man in my section about this, a man I trust completely, and he told me that he had seen something in the eastern courtyard 3 nights before my experience, that he had also told nobody about. He described a cold that arrived before the figures did. He described the hoods. He described the stillness. We agreed that we would not speak of it again. We have kept that agreement. But I am writing this down because I need someone, somewhere, even if it is only a piece of paper in a canvas satchel, to know that what we saw in those ruins was real. It was not exhaustion. It was not fear. It was not the darkness collaborating with stress to produce illusions in tired minds. Something was living in that monastery that had no business being there. Something that belonged to that place in a way that neither we nor the men in the valley below us belonged to it. Something that was there long before the war arrived, and that, God help whoever comes next, will probably be there long after the war is over and all of us are gone. Heinrich Brandt was killed on May the 17th, 1944, 6 days before the monastery finally fell to Allied forces. He was 26 years old. I have spent a long time sitting with these accounts. Thomas Riley's letters, Leonard Shaw's archived interview, Margaret Tate's recorded evenings with her father, Heinrich Brandt's unsent confession in a canvas satchel that sat untouched in a box for 7 years before anyone thought to look inside it. What strikes me most when I lay them all beside each other is not the consistency of what they saw, although that consistency is remarkable. It is the consistency of what they chose to do afterward. Every single one of them made the same decision. They came back down from that ridge, or they backed away from that passage, and they closed a door inside themselves, and they kept it closed, and they got on with the business of being alive. They built lives. They loved people. They carried it quietly, and they carried it alone, and they never once asked anyone else to carry it with them. I think about that choice a great deal. I think about what it costs a person to hold something like that in silence for decades. And I think about what it says about what they saw, that silence felt like the only reasonable response to it. The monastery was rebuilt after the war. It stands today exactly as it stood before the bombardment, restored stone by stone over the years that followed. returned to its position on that ridge above the Leary Valley as if nothing had ever interrupted it. Monks live there again. Tourists visit. The long history of the place resumed and continued, and shows no signs of stopping. I only have one question, and I have never found an answer that satisfies me. When the monks returned to those rebuilt walls and walked those restored corridors and moved through those quiet courtyards in the early dark of the morning, did anything in that building feel like it had been waiting for them? Or did it feel like something was already there,